Hello, and welcome back to the Sleep Lab tonight. Before your own eyes grow heavy, we are going to explore one of the strangest quirks ever discovered in human biology, a rare condition, hiding quietly inside a small number of people, that seems to rewrite the very rules of rest itself. Most of what we know about sleep tells us that 7 to 9 hours is not a preference, but a biological requirement, as fixed and non-negotiable as the need for water or air. And for nearly everyone listening tonight, that remains completely true. But scientists have found a small, strange exception: a handful of people scattered across the world who function brilliantly, sharply, joyfully, on 4 or 5 hours of sleep a night, decade after decade, with no damage, no fog, no cost at all. For years, doctors assumed these people were simply lying, or slowly destroying themselves without realizing it. Then geneticists actually found the reason hiding inside their DNA. Tonight we are going to walk through what that discovery revealed, why history's sharpest minds have long been rumored to belong to this strange category, and this part matters most, why almost none of us should ever try to imitate what their biology does naturally. Understanding a rare gift is not the same as being given permission to chase it recklessly. Before we open the first fact tonight, it's worth being clear about why sleep scientists find this particular condition so scientifically thrilling in the first place. For most of modern medical history, sleep researchers have operated from a fairly uniform baseline assumption that healthy adults sleep need clusters tightly around 7 to 9 hours, with only minor variation explained by age, activity level, or temporary circumstance. Deviating meaningfully below that range was almost always treated as a warning sign, evidence of insomnia, stress, illness, or simple denial about the cost of a demanding lifestyle. What made the discovery we're about to explore so disruptive to that long-held assumption was not that it found people who claimed to need less sleep. Doctors hear that claim constantly, and it is, in the vast majority of cases, simply incorrect. What made it disruptive was that, for the first time, researchers found people whose claim turned out, under the most rigorous scientific testing available, to actually be true. That distinction is the entire foundation of tonight's journey, and it is worth holding onto carefully as we move through each fact, because the line between a fascinating, real biological exception and a dangerous myth people quietly harm themselves chasing is thinner, and more important, than it might first appear. So settle in, let your body sink into the mattress the way it was always designed to, and let your mind wander gently through a mystery that scientists only fully began to unravel within the last 15 years. If this kind of quiet exploration is useful to you, a like, a subscribe, or a thought left below helps this small lab keep its lights on for other sleepy minds finding their way here. But for now, there is nothing left to do but rest and listen. Let's begin. In 2009, a neurologist named Ying-Hui at the University of California, San Francisco, encountered a mother and daughter who seemed, at first glance, to be describing a lifestyle that should not have been medically possible. Both women reported waking naturally, without alarms, after just over 6 hours of sleep, feeling completely rested, energetic, and sharp, a pattern they had maintained their entire lives without any of the cognitive decline, irritability, or health consequences that decades of sleep research had firmly established as the price of chronic sleep restriction. For most researchers, a report like this would have been dismissed instantly as self-deception, the kind of thing people say about themselves without realizing how impaired they actually are. Sleep scientists have a long, well-earned skepticism toward anyone claiming to thrive on unusually little rest, because study after study has shown that people who believe they have adapted to short sleep almost always show measurable cognitive deficits the moment they are tested properly in a lab. But Fu's team decided to actually sequence the family's DNA rather than dismiss the claim outright, and what they found astonished the entire field of sleep science. Buried inside a gene called December 2nd, they discovered a single, specific mutation present in both mother and daughter, and absent in family members who slept a conventional 8 hours. When researchers later engineered mice to carry the same mutation, the mice, too, slept less than their littermates, while showing no signs of the cognitive impairment that sleep-deprived mice normally display. This was the first hard genetic evidence that a small number of humans might not simply be tolerating short sleep through willpower or self-delusion, but might actually possess a fundamentally different, more efficient version of the sleep process itself, built directly into their biology. The discovery didn't just solve one family's medical mystery. It cracked open an entirely new field of research, now sometimes called familial natural short sleep, dedicated to understanding a group of people who appear to need meaningfully less sleep than the rest of us, and appear to suffer none of the consequences that should, by every existing model of sleep science, have caught up with them decades ago. What made Fu's discovery especially compelling to the wider scientific community was not simply that she found an unusual mutation, but how carefully her team worked to rule out every alternative explanation before accepting the extraordinary one. They screened for other known sleep disorders. They tested for common medical conditions that might mimic reduced sleep need without any real biological difference. They studied the family's actual sleep across multiple nights inside a controlled laboratory setting, rather than relying solely on the family's own account of their habits, because self-reported sleep data has historically proven notoriously unreliable, particularly among people convinced they have adapted successfully to less rest. Only once every conventional explanation had been carefully eliminated did the team turn to genetic sequencing, and even then, they did not stop at a single family. Fu's laboratory spent years afterward actively recruiting other people who reported similar lifelong patterns of brief, unforced, seemingly consequence-free sleep, screening hundreds of volunteers to confirm that the December 2nd mutation was not simply a fluke isolated to one household, but part of a genuine, replicable biological pattern. This slow, methodical, almost stubbornly skeptical approach is part of why the discovery has held up so well under subsequent scientific scrutiny, at a time when many sensational health claims quietly collapse the moment other laboratories attempt to reproduce them. The original mother and daughter, once their unusual biology was confirmed, described a lifetime of being quietly, repeatedly disbelieved by the medical establishment before finally being taken seriously. Both had, at various points, consulted doctors concerned about their sleep patterns, and both had been offered the standard clinical assumption applied to nearly anyone reporting unusually short sleep, that they were either misjudging their own alertness, suffering from an undiagnosed anxiety disorder driving compulsive early waking, or simply engaging in a subtle form of denial about the toll their schedule was quietly taking. It was only when Fu's team approached the case with genuine scientific curiosity rather than default clinical suspicion that the family's decades-long experience finally received a biological explanation rather than a psychological one. This detail carries a broader lesson that echoes throughout the rest of tonight's exploration. Rare biological variation is easy to mistake for denial or self-deception, right up until the moment somebody finally builds the right tool to look closely enough to tell the difference. One of the most important distinctions researchers had to establish early on was that natural short sleepers are not simply insomniacs who have made peace with exhaustion. Insomnia is defined by difficulty falling or staying asleep despite wanting and needing more rest, typically accompanied by daytime impairment, irritability, and a persistent sense of unrefreshing sleep. Natural short sleepers show almost the exact opposite profile. They fall asleep quickly, sleep with remarkable efficiency, wake up spontaneously without any grogginess, and report feeling, this is the detail researchers found most striking, genuinely, consistently rested. When their sleep is studied inside a laboratory using polysomnography, the tool that measures brainwave activity throughout the night, something unusual becomes visible almost immediately. Their sleep architecture, the specific sequence and proportion of light sleep, deep slow-wave sleep, and REM sleep that everyone cycles through each night, appears compressed but not degraded. Where an average sleeper might spend a certain proportion of the night working through several full sleep cycles to accumulate enough deep, restorative slow-wave sleep, natural short sleepers seem to reach that same restorative depth far more quickly and efficiently, extracting, in effect, a full night's biological benefit from a noticeably shorter window of time. Researchers describe this less like a person who is simply getting away with less rest, and more like a person whose sleep is simply a more concentrated, higher efficiency version of the same process the rest of us experience in a more diluted, drawn-out form. This distinction matters enormously, because it means the condition cannot be manufactured through habit or discipline. A person forcing themselves awake after 5 hours without possessing the underlying biological efficiency is not experiencing the benefit of short sleep. They are experiencing ordinary sleep deprivation, with all of its well-documented costs to memory, mood, immune function, and long-term health, simply disguised by willpower and caffeine as something it fundamentally is not. There is a particularly useful clinical tool researchers use to separate these two very different populations, called the multiple sleep latency test, which measures how quickly a person falls asleep when given repeated opportunities to nap throughout the day under quiet, controlled conditions. Ordinary sleep-deprived individuals, no matter how alert they believe themselves to be, tend to fall asleep remarkably quickly during these controlled naps, often within just a few minutes, because their accumulated sleep debt is quietly pulling them toward unconsciousness the moment external stimulation is removed. Genuine natural short sleepers, when given the same opportunity, typically show the opposite pattern, taking considerably longer to fall asleep during the daytime, or in many cases failing to fall asleep at all, because their nightly sleep genuinely satisfied their biological need rather than merely dulling their perception of an unmet one. This single test has become one of the clearest, most objective ways researchers can distinguish a person who is truly thriving on less sleep from a person who has simply become skilled at masking impairment during waking hours, a distinction that self-report alone, however sincere, has repeatedly proven incapable of reliably making on its own. Long before geneticists ever found a gene for short sleep, popular history had already built an entire mythology around brilliant people who apparently needed almost none of it. Thomas Edison reportedly viewed sleep as, in his own words, an inexcusable waste of time, and claimed to sleep in short bursts totaling only a few hours a night, supplementing his schedule with brief naps he took while seated in a chair, sometimes holding a metal ball above a pan so that the clatter of it falling would wake him the moment he drifted into deeper sleep. Leonardo da Vinci is frequently, if somewhat unreliably, credited with an extreme form of polyphasic sleep, napping for short intervals every few hours around the clock rather than sleeping in one consolidated block, though many historians now consider this particular claim more legend than documented fact. Napoleon Bonaparte was famously reported by his contemporaries to sleep only a few hours most nights, remaining alert enough to manage military campaigns that required near-constant decision-making under pressure. Margaret Thatcher, Britain's longest-serving Prime Minister of the 20th century, was widely reported throughout her time in office to function on roughly 4 hours of sleep a night, a pattern colleagues described as remarkably consistent across decades in one of the most demanding jobs in the world. It's worth being honest here about how much of this historical record is reliable data versus flattering legend. Biographers and the subjects themselves often had strong incentives to exaggerate tireless productivity as a symbol of extraordinary character. But modern genetic research has added a genuinely interesting wrinkle to these old stories. If familial natural short sleep really does run in families, as the December 2nd discovery strongly suggests, then at least some of history's short-sleeping high achievers may not have been superhuman through discipline alone. They may simply have inherited, entirely by chance, the same rare biological variant researchers are only now beginning to map in detail. It is worth adding one more layer of nuance to these historical stories, because the record is messier than the popular legends often suggest. Winston Churchill, another figure frequently cited in lists of short-sleeping leaders, is a particularly instructive case. Churchill did indeed sleep relatively little at night by conventional standards, but biographical and historical accounts make clear that he compensated deliberately and consistently with a substantial afternoon nap, sometimes lasting close to 2 hours, a habit he considered essential and defended fiercely even amid wartime pressure. This detail rarely survives in the simplified, inspirational version of his story, yet it matters enormously, because it suggests Churchill may not have been a true natural short sleeper at all, but rather someone practicing a form of biphasic sleep, splitting his rest across 2 separate periods in a way that, when totaled honestly across a full day, likely approached a far more conventional total than the dramatic nighttime figure alone implies. This distinction is a useful reminder for tonight's exploration as a whole. History's short-sleeping legends are a fascinating starting point for curiosity, but rarely a reliable source of verified biological fact on their own, which is precisely why the genetic research that followed decades later has proven so much more valuable than the folklore that came before it. There is one more historical wrinkle worth mentioning, because it points toward something researchers now take quite seriously. Salvador Dalí reportedly used an unusual technique to harness the fleeting, hypnagogic state at the very edge of sleep, holding a spoon or key over a metal plate while dozing in a chair, so that the moment his muscles relaxed enough for the object to fall and clatter awake, he would immediately capture the strange, associative images floating through his mind in that transitional state before returning to work. Salvador Dalí was not, as far as historical accounts indicate, a natural short sleeper at all. He was deliberately exploiting a completely different, much shorter phenomenon, the drowsy threshold between wakefulness and true sleep, sometimes called the hypnagogic state, which modern sleep researchers have since confirmed is genuinely associated with unusual bursts of loose, creative, associative thinking, distinct from anything happening deep inside slow-wave or REM sleep. This distinction matters because it illustrates how easily different sleep-related phenomena get folded together in popular retellings, when in fact underlying laboratory science, once it finally arrives, often reveals several genuinely separate mechanisms hiding underneath a single simplified legend. To understand what December 2nd actually does inside the body, it helps to picture the brain's sleep system as a finely tuned set of counterweights, constantly balancing the pressure to sleep against the pressure to stay awake. December 2nd is a gene involved in regulating orexin, a neurochemical that plays a central role in promoting wakefulness and stabilizing the sleep-wake cycle. In people carrying the specific mutation Fu's team identified, December 2nd appears to shift this balance in a very particular way, altering how much accumulated sleep pressure, the biological need for rest that builds up the longer a person stays awake, is required before the body considers its need for sleep fully satisfied. In most people, roughly 8 hours of accumulated sleep pressure needs to be released each night before the brain considers the debt cleared. In carriers of this mutation, the threshold appears to sit meaningfully lower, meaning the biological need for sleep is genuinely, measurably smaller to begin with, rather than simply being ignored or overridden by willpower. This is a crucial distinction that separates natural short sleepers from everyone who has ever tried to train themselves into needing less rest through sheer stubbornness. The mutation does not teach the brain to tolerate a debt. It changes how large the debt is in the first place. Researchers studying the mutation's effects at a cellular level have found that it influences how efficiently the brain clears certain byproducts that accumulate during waking hours and are believed to contribute to the subjective feeling of tiredness, suggesting that natural short sleepers may simply be running a more efficient overnight cleanup process, one that finishes its essential work in a genuinely shorter window rather than the body compensating in some risky, invisible way that will eventually catch up with them. Orexin itself deserves a moment of closer attention, because it sits at the center of several important discoveries in sleep medicine well beyond this particular mutation. The same neurochemical system disrupted in December 2nd carriers is also, in an almost inverse fashion, the system that fails in people with narcolepsy, a genuine sleep disorder in which orexin-producing neurons are gradually destroyed, leaving patients unable to maintain stable wakefulness and prone to sudden, uncontrollable sleep attacks during the day. Seeing orexin sit at the center of two such strikingly opposite conditions, a rare gift of efficient short sleep on one end, and a serious, debilitating disorder of fragmented, unpredictable sleep on the other, has given researchers a much richer appreciation for how delicately balanced this single neurochemical pathway actually is. It has also opened an entirely new avenue of pharmaceutical research, with several medications targeting the orexin system already approved for treating chronic insomnia by promoting sleep through a different mechanism than older sedatives, and other orexin-based treatments currently being explored for narcolepsy and related conditions, illustrating how a rare genetic curiosity discovered in a single family can, over time, ripple outward into treatments that may eventually help millions of people with far more common sleep struggles. Since the original December 2nd discovery, Fu's laboratory and others working in the same field have identified several additional genes associated with natural short sleep, revealing that this trait is not tied to a single genetic switch but appears to involve multiple independent pathways that can each produce a similar outcome. A gene called ADRB1, involved in a region of the brainstem linked to arousal and wakefulness, was identified in a separate short-sleeping family, and when researchers engineered the same mutation into mice, those mice also slept significantly less than normal while showing no signs of impairment on cognitive testing. Another gene, NPSR1, associated with a neuropeptide receptor involved in regulating both sleep and stress responses, was found in yet another naturally short-sleeping family, and interestingly, mice engineered with this particular mutation showed not only reduced sleep need but also demonstrated improved memory performance compared to ordinary mice, hinting at a possible link between this specific sleep pathway and enhanced memory consolidation. A fourth gene, GRM1, involved in glutamate signaling important for neural communication throughout the brain, has since joined the growing list. What makes this expanding catalog of genes so scientifically significant is what it suggests about the broader nature of sleep itself. Rather than being one single, monolithic process governed by a single master switch, sleep appears to be orchestrated by multiple semi-independent systems working in concert, any one of which, when altered in just the right way, can meaningfully shift how much total sleep a person's body actually requires. This has encouraged some researchers to speculate, cautiously, that understanding these pathways in greater depth could eventually inform treatments for people suffering from genuine sleep disorders, though they are careful to emphasize that we remain a considerable distance from anything resembling a safe way to replicate these effects artificially in people who were not born with them. There is also something quietly humbling in how these genes were actually found. Methodologically speaking, that says a great deal about the patience good science often requires. None of these discoveries came from a targeted search for a specific gene researchers already suspected. Each one emerged from years of painstaking family recruitment, careful clinical verification, and whole genome sequencing performed on families who had, in some cases, been quietly living with their unusual sleep pattern for generations without ever imagining it might be scientifically significant enough to study. Fu has described the process as something closer to detective work than traditional laboratory experimentation, requiring her team to first build trust with families who had often been mocked, disbelieved, or dismissed by previous doctors before finally finding a researcher willing to take their unusual biology seriously rather than assuming they were simply misjudging their own exhaustion. This human dimension of the research is easy to overlook amid the more dramatic genetic findings, but it matters, because it reflects something researchers in this field mention often. Many of the families who eventually provided the genetic material behind these discoveries had spent years being told, incorrectly, that what they were experiencing wasn't real. Beyond the 4 genes discussed so far, researchers have continued expanding their search using increasingly large genetic databases, cross-referencing thousands of anonymized genomes against detailed sleep questionnaires and, where available, wearable device data tracking actual sleep duration over extended periods in the real world rather than relying solely on self-report. This large-scale approach has begun turning up additional candidate genes and regions of the genome that appear statistically associated with naturally shorter sleep duration across broader, more diverse populations, beyond the small number of individually verified families studied in depth so far. Much of this newer research remains preliminary, requiring the same painstaking functional verification, including animal studies and careful clinical confirmation, before any additional gene can be added with confidence to the established list. But the overall trajectory of the field suggests that familial natural short sleep, once thought to be an almost impossibly rare curiosity limited to a handful of documented families worldwide, may ultimately prove to involve a broader and more varied set of genetic pathways than researchers initially suspected when Fu's team published their first findings back in 2009. When researchers place natural short sleepers into a sleep laboratory and monitor their brain activity through the night using electroencephalography, several distinctive patterns tend to emerge. Slow-wave sleep, the deepest stage associated with physical restoration and the clearing of metabolic byproducts from the brain, appears to arrive more quickly after the person falls asleep and occupies a larger proportion of their overall, shortened sleep period compared to an average sleeper's night. In other words, they are not simply cutting corners on deep sleep to squeeze in more waking hours. If anything, they appear to prioritize and concentrate this most physically restorative stage even more efficiently than typical sleepers do. REM sleep, the stage most closely associated with memory consolidation, emotional processing, and dreaming, also appears to follow an accelerated but largely complete pattern in many natural short sleepers, suggesting the brain is still accomplishing its essential nightly maintenance tasks, simply within a considerably tighter timeframe. Some researchers studying these unusual sleep architectures have compared the phenomenon to a highly optimized piece of software completing the same essential computations as a less efficient program, but doing so using dramatically fewer processing cycles. The analogy is imperfect, since brains are not computers, but it captures something true about what the data seems to show. This is not sleep that has been shortened by cutting corners, but sleep that appears to have been genuinely compressed, retaining its essential restorative functions while requiring less total time to complete them. This is precisely the finding that separates true natural short sleepers from the far larger population of people who simply believe they have adapted to less rest. When ordinary sleep-deprived individuals are studied under the same laboratory conditions, their brain activity tells a very different story. Fragmented sleep architecture, reduced slow-wave sleep, and clear physiological markers of an unpaid biological debt quietly accumulating night after night, invisible to the person experiencing it but unmistakable on the recording. Sleep researchers have also paid close attention to a specific brainwave pattern called sleep spindles, brief bursts of oscillating electrical activity that occur primarily during the lighter stages of non-REM sleep and are believed to play an important role in protecting sleep continuity while also supporting memory consolidation. Some studies of natural short sleepers have found their sleep spindle activity to be notably robust, occurring with a density and consistency comparable to, or in some measurements exceeding, what is typically observed in ordinary sleepers across a much longer night. Because sleep spindles are thought to help transfer newly formed memories from short-term storage in the hippocampus into more durable long-term storage elsewhere in the cortex, their surprising strength in this population has led some researchers to speculate that natural short sleepers may be accomplishing a night's worth of memory consolidation using a more concentrated, efficient burst of this specific neural activity, rather than needing it spread out across the same extended timeframe most brains apparently require. This remains an active area of ongoing investigation rather than settled scientific fact, but it offers one more compelling clue pointing toward the same underlying theme running through nearly every finding in this field. Whatever is happening inside these unusual brains during sleep, it does not appear to be a shortcut or an omission. It appears to be compression, with remarkably little lost along the way. As researchers gathered more natural short sleepers into their studies, they began noticing a pattern that had nothing to do with brainwaves at all, but showed up consistently enough across interviews and psychological assessments to warrant serious attention. Many natural short sleepers reported unusually high levels of optimism, energy, and what researchers sometimes describe as a heightened baseline mood, even when directly compared to well-rested individuals who simply happened to sleep a conventional 8 hours. Some participants also reported a notably elevated tolerance for physical pain and discomfort compared to population averages, an unexpected finding that researchers are still working to fully explain, though some have speculated it may connect to the same underlying neurochemical pathways involved in regulating both sleep pressure and pain perception, given how closely intertwined these systems are known to be at a biological level. Multitasking ability, along with a general sense of drive and productivity, has also emerged repeatedly in qualitative interviews with natural short sleepers, many of whom describe themselves, largely without prompting, as people who simply feel restless with unstructured time and gravitate naturally towards staying busy, engaged, and mentally occupied. It is worth being appropriately cautious about drawing sweeping conclusions from personality traits reported in relatively small research samples, since self-selection and self-report always carry some risk of bias. People who volunteer for a study about being unusually productive short sleepers may already skew toward describing themselves in flattering terms. Still, the consistency of the pattern across multiple independent research groups has led some scientists to wonder whether the same underlying genetic and neurochemical differences that reduce these individual sleep requirements may also subtly shape mood regulation, stress resilience, and temperament more broadly, suggesting that the trait may never be quite as simple as needs less sleep and may instead reflect a broader, more integrated difference in how their nervous system is calibrated altogether. Some researchers investigating this personality overlap have drawn a cautious but intriguing comparison to what is sometimes called hypomanic temperament in psychological literature, a milder, non-clinical cousin of the elevated mood and energy seen in hypomania, characterized by high drive, reduced need for rest, and an unusually buoyant baseline outlook, without crossing into the impairment or instability associated with actual bipolar spectrum conditions. Researchers are careful to draw a firm, explicit line here, emphasizing repeatedly that familial natural short sleep is a distinct, physically verified genetic trait and not a psychiatric condition, and that conflating the two would be both scientifically inaccurate and potentially harmful to people managing genuine mood disorders, for whom reduced sleep need is frequently a warning sign of instability rather than a stable, lifelong gift. The comparison is raised in the scientific literature not to blur that important line, but simply to note that researchers studying temperament more broadly have long observed that sleep need, mood regulation, and baseline energy levels appear to be governed by overlapping neurochemical systems throughout the brain, which may help explain why a genetic variant originally discovered because of its effect on sleep duration alone turned out, upon closer study, to carry these additional, somewhat unexpected personality signatures along with it. There is also a practical, almost bittersweet observation researchers have made while interviewing natural short sleepers about the lived experience of their trait. Many describe an unusual relationship with time itself, reporting that their extra waking hours each day, compounded across a lifetime, feel less like a burden and more like a quiet, private gift. Additional hours for reading, working, exercising, or simply sitting in stillness before the rest of the household wakes, without ever feeling the fatigue that would normally accompany hours stolen from sleep. Several participants in qualitative interviews described these early hours as some of the most peaceful, productive parts of their entire day, largely because they are not fighting exhaustion to claim them the way an ordinary sleep-deprived person would be. It is a small, human detail easy to overlook amid the gene names and laboratory measurements, but it captures something important about why this trait continues to fascinate both scientists and the public alike. It is not simply a biological curiosity, but a genuinely different daily experience of time itself, one most of us can only briefly imagine borrowing for a single unusually well-rested morning. Perhaps the most consistently startling finding across this entire body of research is what happens, or rather what does not happen, when natural short sleepers are put through standard cognitive testing after their normal, unusually brief night of sleep. In the general population, even mild, chronic sleep restriction produces measurable, reproducible declines in reaction time, working memory, attention span, and decision-making accuracy, deficits so well established that sleep-deprived cognitive performance has been directly compared, in some studies, to functioning under the influence of alcohol at levels that would be illegal to drive with. Natural short sleepers tested after their characteristic 4 to 6 hours show none of these expected impairments. Their performance on memory tasks, sustained attention tests, and complex problem-solving exercises falls comfortably within, and sometimes above, normal ranges typically associated with fully rested individuals sleeping 7 to 9 hours. This finding alone was enough to convince many initially skeptical researchers that something genuinely different was occurring biologically, rather than simply observing a population of people who had become unusually good at masking impairment through sheer willpower or caffeine. A pattern that typically becomes visible under sufficiently rigorous laboratory testing regardless of how well a person believes they are compensating. What makes this especially significant scientifically is what it implies about the actual function of sleep itself. If a smaller amount of sleep, under the right biological conditions, can accomplish the same essential cognitive maintenance as a much larger amount, it suggests that the standard 8-hour recommendation, while an accurate and important average for the general population, may represent something closer to a biological ceiling shaped by typical efficiency rather than an absolute, universal requirement fixed identically in every human nervous system, a distinction that matters enormously for how researchers think about the underlying purpose of sleep going forward. It's worth pausing on just how demanding these cognitive tests actually are, because the strength of this finding depends entirely on the rigor of the testing itself. Researchers did not simply ask participants how sharp they felt. They administered standardized batteries used throughout clinical sleep medicine, including tasks that measure sustained vigilance over extended periods, working memory tests that require holding and manipulating multiple pieces of information simultaneously, and psychomotor vigilance tasks that measure reaction time with millisecond precision, the same kind of testing used in research on drowsy driving and workplace fatigue. These tests are specifically designed to catch subtle impairments that a person would never notice through simple self-assessment, which is precisely why they are considered the gold standard for detecting the real-world consequences of insufficient sleep. The fact that natural short sleepers pass these rigorous, objective measures cleanly, night after night, year after year, is what ultimately convinced skeptical sleep researchers that this population represented something genuinely different from ordinary sleep-deprived individuals who had simply grown accustomed to functioning below their true cognitive baseline without realizing it. Some of the most compelling testing in this area comes from studies of sustained, multi-day cognitive endurance, rather than single-session snapshots. Ordinary participants subjected to gradual, mild sleep restriction over a period of 1 to 2 weeks show a well-documented, almost linear decline in performance across successive days, even if their subjective sense of tiredness plateaus relatively early and stops increasing noticeably, creating a dangerous illusion of having successfully adapted while actual measured performance continues quietly worsening beneath the surface. When researchers have tracked natural short sleepers across similarly extended observation periods, no such cumulative decline appears. Their performance on day 14 looks essentially indistinguishable from their performance on day 1, a pattern researchers describe as flat rather than declining, which stands in sharp, almost visually striking contrast when the two datasets are plotted side by side on the same graph. This flat trajectory, more than almost any single test result, is what convinces sleep researchers that natural short sleepers are not slowly accumulating a hidden debt that simply hasn't caught up with them yet, but are genuinely, sustainably operating within their true biological limits night after night. Sleep and immune function are deeply, intricately connected, and decades of research have firmly established that chronic sleep deprivation weakens the immune system's ability to fight off infection, slows wound healing, and is associated with elevated inflammation markers linked to a wide range of long-term health risks. Given how firmly this connection has been established, researchers studying natural short sleepers were understandably curious, and somewhat concerned, about what they might find when they examined this population's immune markers and long-term health outcomes. What they found, at least so far, has been reassuring rather than alarming. Natural short sleepers studied to date do not appear to show the elevated inflammation markers or immune dysfunction typically associated with chronic sleep restriction in the general population, a finding consistent with the broader theory that their bodies are not accumulating an unpaid biological debt at all, but are simply completing the same essential restorative processes, immune maintenance included, within a genuinely shorter window. Some researchers have gone further, noting preliminary evidence suggesting certain natural short sleepers may show resilience to specific stressors, including some indications of enhanced pain tolerance and faster recovery from minor physical stress, findings that remain under active investigation and have not yet been established with the same level of confidence as the core sleep architecture findings. It is important to note that this research remains relatively young, the sample sizes studied so far are still comparatively small, and researchers are careful to avoid overstating conclusions about long-term health outcomes until longer studies have had time to accumulate sufficient data across full lifespans. Still, the early picture forming is consistent and coherent. This does not appear to be a population quietly paying a hidden physiological price for their unusual sleep schedule, but rather a population whose underlying biology has been fundamentally recalibrated in a way that keeps the full restorative function of sleep intact. One particularly compelling piece of this evidence comes from research into cardiovascular health, an area where chronic sleep deprivation in the general population has been linked, across decades of large-scale studies, to meaningfully elevated risk of high blood pressure, heart disease, and stroke over time. If natural short sleepers were secretly accumulating the same hidden damage as ordinary sleep-deprived individuals, researchers would expect to eventually see these same elevated cardiovascular risks emerging in long-term follow-up data as this population ages. So far, the limited long-term data available has not shown this pattern, though researchers are quick to caution that because the trait is so rare and was only formally identified within the last decade and a half, truly long-term, large-scale health outcome data spanning entire lifetimes simply does not exist yet, and won't for some time. This is one of the honest, open questions the field still carries. The early evidence is genuinely encouraging, but sleep scientists studying this population remain committed to careful, ongoing, decades-long observation before making any confident, sweeping claims about lifelong health outcomes, a caution that reflects good scientific practice rather than any current sign of concern in the data collected so far. Given how much attention this discovery has received, it is worth pausing on an important, sobering detail. True natural short sleepers, verified through genetic testing and laboratory sleep studies, appear to represent a vanishingly small percentage of the overall population, with researchers estimating the prevalence at well under 1%, and some specific mutations identified so far appearing to be exceptionally rare even within that already small group. This detail matters enormously, because it stands in stark contrast to the far larger number of people who casually describe themselves as needing little sleep, a self-identification that survey research has repeatedly shown to be unreliable when tested rigorously in a laboratory setting. Studies specifically designed to compare self-reported short sleepers against objectively verified natural short sleepers have found that the overwhelming majority of people who believe they thrive on minimal sleep are, in fact, chronically sleep-deprived and simply unaware of the cumulative cognitive and health costs they are quietly accumulating, having adapted, psychologically rather than biologically, to a baseline of impairment that has become their normal. Researchers studying this discrepancy describe a phenomenon where sleep-deprived individuals lose the ability to accurately judge their own level of impairment the longer their sleep debt continues, meaning the very people least equipped to notice their own cognitive decline are, ironically, often the most confident that they have successfully adapted to needing less rest. This is precisely why researchers insist that genuine familial natural short sleep can only be confirmed through objective genetic testing and controlled laboratory observation, rather than personal conviction or lifestyle habit, no matter how many years a person has maintained a particular sleep schedule or how capable they subjectively feel while doing it. This raises a natural question worth sitting with quietly: if the trait is this rare, and this difficult to verify without genetic testing, how would a person even begin to suspect they might genuinely belong to this small group rather than simply being a well-adapted but ultimately impaired sleep-deprived individual? Researchers studying the condition suggest a few loose, informal markers worth genuine curiosity, while stressing that none of them substitute for real testing. A lifelong pattern, present since early childhood and unrelated to caffeine, stress, work demands, or any deliberate effort to sleep less, is one meaningful signal, since the trait is present from birth rather than developed gradually through habit. Waking naturally and consistently without an alarm, feeling immediately alert rather than groggy, is another. A family history of the same unforced pattern across multiple generations, particularly if it appears in a parent, child, or sibling independently of shared household habits, adds further weight. Even with all of these markers present, researchers emphasize that genuine confirmation would still require formal laboratory testing and genetic analysis, precisely because self-perception has proven so unreliable in this specific area of human experience, and because the stakes of being wrong quietly, chronically shortchanging one's own brain and body for years based on a mistaken self-assessment, are simply too high to leave to guesswork alone. Researchers have also noted an interesting social pattern among people who eventually seek out formal testing after suspecting they might belong to this rare group. Many describe having spent years feeling quietly out of step with the world around them, waking hours before everyone else in their household, feeling restless and almost guilty during the early morning hours when they had nothing productive to do while the rest of their family still slept, or struggling to explain to friends, partners, and employers why they simply did not seem to need the amount of rest that every wellness article, doctor's recommendation, and casual conversation assumed was universal. For some confirmed natural short sleepers, receiving formal genetic and clinical confirmation has been described as less a medical discovery and more a kind of long-delayed permission, finally replacing decades of quiet self-doubt with a simple, validated biological explanation for a difference they had been living with, largely alone, their entire lives. This brings us to what may be the single most important fact in tonight's entire exploration, and the one researchers are most emphatic about communicating clearly: familial natural short sleep is not a lifestyle that can be adopted, trained into, or willed into existence through discipline, caffeine, or gradual habit formation. For the vast majority of people who do not carry one of these rare genetic variants, deliberately restricting sleep to 4 or 5 hours a night produces exactly the outcomes that decades of sleep research have consistently documented: measurable impairment in memory consolidation, reduced emotional regulation, slower reaction times, weakened immune function, increased risk of cardiovascular disease over time, and a well-established link to greater long-term risk of several serious chronic health conditions. The tragedy researchers have observed, again and again, is that the popular fascination with short-sleeping high achievers has, at times, encouraged ordinary people without the underlying biology to attempt the same schedule, mistaking cultural admiration for tirelessness as evidence that their own body could simply be trained to require less rest. Sleep researchers are unambiguous on this point. The accumulated cognitive science strongly indicates that sleep need is not meaningfully trainable downward in people who do not carry these specific genetic variants, and that people who believe they have successfully adapted to chronic short sleep are, in the overwhelming majority of documented cases, simply experiencing a diminished capacity to accurately perceive their own impairment, not an actual reduction in their underlying biological need for rest. If there is one piece of practical guidance to carry forward from tonight's exploration, it is this: admiration for a rare genetic gift should never be mistaken for a lifestyle instruction, and for nearly everyone listening, the healthiest, most protective, most genuinely performance-enhancing choice remains the same one sleep researchers have recommended consistently for decades: a full, unhurried 7 to 9 hours, treated not as a luxury to be minimized, but as one of the most powerful, evidence-based tools available for protecting both the mind and the body over an entire lifetime. It's worth being specific about what the accumulated research actually shows happens to people who chronically shortchange themselves without carrying this rare protective genetics, because the abstraction of impairment can be easy to underestimate from a distance. Sustained sleep restriction to 5 or 6 hours a night, maintained over just 2 weeks in controlled laboratory studies among ordinary volunteers, has been shown to produce cognitive performance deficits equivalent to a full night of total sleep deprivation, even though the participants in these studies consistently reported feeling only mildly tired, having grown subjectively used to their reduced sleep despite their measured performance falling substantially. This gap between how impaired a chronically sleep-restricted person actually is and how impaired they believe themselves to be is, according to sleep researchers, one of the most consistently underappreciated findings in the entire field, and it is precisely the gap that makes the short-sleeping genius narrative so genuinely risky to imitate. The people most confident that they have successfully adapted to less sleep are, according to the data, often the very people least able to accurately judge their own condition anymore, which is exactly why researchers keep returning to objective laboratory measurement rather than personal conviction as the only reliable way to actually know the difference. Long before geneticists identified specific mutations like December 2nd, researchers studying twins had already established that sleep duration and sleep quality show a meaningful hereditary component, with identical twins, who share virtually all of their genetic material, showing far more similar sleep patterns to one another than fraternal twins, who share roughly half. These early twin studies estimated that a substantial portion of the variation in natural sleep duration across the general population, somewhere in the range of 30 to 50% depending on the specific study, could be attributed to genetic factors rather than environment, habit, or lifestyle choice alone. This laid important groundwork for the later molecular discoveries, confirming that sleep need was not purely a product of culture, work schedule, or personal discipline, but was, to a significant degree, something written into a person's biology well before they ever developed sleep habits of their own. Family studies of confirmed natural short sleepers have extended this picture further, showing that the trait consistently runs through multiple generations of the same family, appearing in parents, children, and siblings in patterns consistent with what geneticists call autosomal dominant inheritance, meaning a child of a natural short sleeper has, roughly speaking, a 50% chance of inheriting the same trait if only one parent carries the mutation. This has allowed researchers to trace specific family lineages across several generations, documenting grandparents, parents, and children who all independently report the same lifelong pattern of brief, high-quality, unforced sleep, long before any of them had access to genetic testing that could confirm what their own family history had already, quietly, been demonstrating all along. Twin studies have also offered researchers a uniquely powerful tool for separating genetic influence from environment more broadly across the entire population's sleep habits, not just within families carrying rare short sleep mutations. By comparing identical twins raised together against identical twins separated early in life and raised in different households, researchers have been able to estimate how much of an individual's natural sleep timing, duration, and even their tendency toward being a morning or evening person is shaped by inherited biology versus upbringing and environment. These studies consistently find that even when identical twins are raised entirely apart, in different homes, different cities, sometimes different countries, their natural sleep patterns remain remarkably similar to one another, considerably more similar than would be expected by chance alone, offering strong independent confirmation that sleep, far from being purely a matter of habit or discipline, is substantially written into our biology from the very beginning, with rare variants like the December 2nd mutation representing simply the most extreme, most dramatically visible end of a much broader genetic spectrum that quietly shapes everyone's relationship with rest. This broader genetic spectrum also helps explain something many people notice anecdotally within their own families without ever having a scientific name for it: why one sibling has always been a natural early riser who springs out of bed cheerfully while another has always struggled through mornings no matter how early they went to bed the night before, or why sleep duration and timing preferences seem to run in certain families with a consistency that feels like more than mere coincidence or shared household habit. While these ordinary variations are governed by many genes working together in far subtler combinations than the single, powerful mutations behind true familial natural short sleep, researchers view this entire body of twin and family research as part of the same continuous scientific story, one that has steadily moved sleep science away from treating sleep need as a simple, universal, one-size-fits-all number, and toward a richer, more accurate understanding of sleep as a genuinely individualized biological trait, shaped by inheritance in ways that are only now beginning to be mapped in real detail. We close tonight not with an instruction to sleep less, but with something far more useful for the overwhelming majority of people who do not carry any of these rare genetic variants: a clearer understanding of what natural short sleepers' biology reveals about sleep efficiency itself, and how those same underlying principles, safely scaled to a normal 7 to 9 hour window, might genuinely improve the quality of everyone's rest. Researchers studying the sleep architecture of natural short sleepers have noted several habits and conditions that appear to support their unusually efficient deep and REM sleep stages, and while these habits cannot substitute for the underlying genetic difference, sleep scientists broadly agree that the same conditions, a cool, dark, quiet sleeping environment, a consistent sleep and wake schedule maintained even on weekends, minimal light exposure in the hours before bed, and avoiding alcohol and heavy meals close to sleep meaningfully improve sleep efficiency and the proportion of restorative deep sleep obtained by ordinary sleepers as well, even without ever changing their total number of hours in bed. In other words, while none of us can safely borrow the shortened duration natural short sleepers enjoy, nearly all of us can borrow the underlying principle their biology quietly demonstrates, that the quality, depth, and efficiency of sleep matters every bit as much as its raw quantity, and that small, consistent improvements to sleep environment and timing can measurably deepen the restorative value of the very same 7 to 9 hours the rest of us still genuinely need. There is something quietly reassuring in this final fact, even if it isn't the shortcut the video's title may have promised. Genius, it turns out, was never really hiding inside a shorter night. It was hiding inside a more efficient one, and efficiency, unlike a rare mutation, is something every single one of us, tonight, still has the power to build. There is one final, practical insight sleep researchers often emphasize, and it is a comforting one to end on. The single biggest, most evidence-backed lever most people actually have available to them is not duration at all, but consistency, going to bed and waking at close to the same time every single day, weekends included, rather than accumulating a debt through the week and attempting to repay it all at once with a long weekend lie-in. Studies on what researchers call social jet lag, the mismatch between a person's weekday and weekend sleep schedule, have found that this inconsistency alone, independent of total sleep duration, is associated with measurably worse mood, metabolic health, and cognitive performance, essentially forcing the body's internal clock to experience something like a mild, self-inflicted time zone change every single week. Natural short sleepers, interestingly, tend to report remarkably rigid, consistent sleep timing, waking at nearly the same hour every day of their lives without needing an alarm to enforce it. For the rest of us, that same consistency, deliberately built rather than genetically given, remains one of the most reliable, freely available tools we have for getting closer to the deep, efficient, restorative sleep their biology provides for free. Tonight we travel through a genuinely rare corner of human biology, a mutation discovered almost by accident in a mother and daughter who simply refused to accept that their unusual nights meant something was wrong with them. We walk through the genes now known to shape this trait, the compressed but complete architecture of their strange, efficient sleep, the personality patterns researchers noticed almost by surprise, and the sobering, important reminder that this particular gift cannot be earned through willpower, no matter how much cultural mythology around tireless genius might suggest otherwise. We looked, too, at what twin studies and family trees reveal about where traits like this quietly travel, generation after generation, long before science had the tools to name them. And we ended, as these journeys often do, somewhere gentler than where we began, not with a challenge to sleep less, but with a reminder that the real secret hiding inside tonight's story was never duration at all. It was depth. It was consistency. It was the quiet, unglamorous discipline of giving your own mind the conditions it needs to do its best, deepest work each night, however many hours you happen to have been given to do it in. If tonight's exploration was worth your time, a like, a subscribe, or a thought left below helps the Sleep Lab keep its doors open for the next curious, sleepy mind who finds their way here. And if you're still awake, there's another story waiting just beyond this one, whenever you're ready for it. But for now, let your thoughts slow. Let your body settle fully into the mattress beneath you. Let tonight be one of the deep, efficient, quietly restorative nights every mind, genius or otherwise, actually deserves. Sleep well. And good night.